Hello. Our text today is found in Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 34, and it goes, When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." I'll begin with a centering, sobering thought. You will never know the full impact of your life on those around you. You just won't. You just can't. You'll know some of it, not all of it. And with this in mind, we should probably ask ourselves the question, in what ways does my life, an example, bring life and many good things into the lives of, say, my children, my spouse, my friends, or even strangers? And conversely, in what ways does my life and example harm them? Here's the truth. I know that I've spoken damaging words and have committed harmful actions which no doubt have been as poison pumped into the spirit of those around me. The worst is when it happens whilst I'm unawares, ignorant, or simply not attending to the effects that I am having on those around me. But what about those times when we are more deliberate? When we treat those around us rudely or with impatience and on purpose because we think we have the right or that they deserve it? What of waiters that are dressed down for getting orders wrong? What of people in call centers who we have on the line who are bearing the brunt of our frustrations, listening patiently about the issues we are having with, say, our internet providers? What of the rude gestures born out of frustration whilst driving? And here is the sobering point I'm trying to make. All of these actions have impacts, large and small. And we don't know the degree or the depth of the impacts our actions make on those around us, or what kind of days that those people are having, into whose lives we are speaking such things, and what effect they are having. It's like we're stumbling through life as my children do through neatly folded laundry, unawares of the damage that they are leaving in their wake and the hard work they are undoing. Somehow, we must open our eyes to the ways in which we hurt those around us, perhaps peeling back layers of self-deception and cognitive dissonance, and then we must trust that God will give us a new heart, the heart of a healer. Jesus has the heart of a healer. Our story opens with Jesus exiting a boat. Sometimes Jesus would board a boat to get away from the crowd, go to the other side of the lake, and in this case, the crowd followed him. All this to say, he is being inconvenienced at the very least, and at worst, being outright harassed. So the crowd is imposing upon him, pressed in on him as the text reads, and one man has the gall to fall prostrate before Jesus, begging, pleading, And you know it's rude to be so forward. No one likes it. And I know that I am torn between my ethical scruples and my own annoyance when I am confronted with, say, a beggar. But this beggar was not asking for food or money, like the beggars that I meet, but was rather pleading for his daughter's very life. Now, we'll discuss next week how this beggar, named Jairus, was a man of means and higher social status, how, unlike beggars who routinely interrupt my life, he has some clout. Perhaps if a Jairus came to my door, then I'd be compelled by way of social obligation to act. Again, more on this next week. Suffice it to say, Jesus does what we've come to expect him to do at this point. He engages, although he doesn't have to. He answers the man's request in the affirmative and then proves that he's good for his word by interrupting his schedule and visiting the man at his home. Again, we'll pick up on this next week. For now, I'd like to focus on the woman who meets Jesus along the way. Unlike Jairus, she isn't given a name. She doesn't have the clout. She is like the nameless, inconvenient beggars that I am used to interacting with. And the more you learn about her, the less attractive she appears in light of the social conventions of her day. 1, she is a woman who isn't accompanied by a man, and therefore is likely a ward of the community. Women who are not attached to some patriarch were. Women in her world were expected to be under the tutelage of some patriarch, her husband, father, or brother. Cringe, I know, but that was her world in those days. So as a woman, she couldn't own property, much less advocate publicly for herself. So this explains why she didn't address Jesus directly as Jairus had done, but rather discreetly sought him out secretly. Doesn't want to be noticed, because for her to address him directly would have been a scandal. Second thing that comes between her and possible healing and acceptance in her community is that she has been bleeding continuously for more than a decade, rendering her perpetually a part of the class then called unclean. Women on their periods even were thought of as unclean and were to be sent out of the city. And here is a bleeding woman, bleeding for 12 years. Women like her weren't to be touched until they were proclaimed ceremonially clean. That is, if she were a Hebrew, if she were a Gentile, which we don't know if she was, how much worse for her. All this being said, what she knows from the onset is that there is no way she can approach Jesus like Jairus did. So she surreptitiously and secretly touches Jesus' cloak. And it's the best that she can do, a swing for the fences in the face of everything else. And hope against hope, she is healed. And Jesus realizes right away that something has happened and turns to the crowd to discover who had been made well by way of the power he had felt exit his body. He did not heal her on purpose, apparently. It more or less happened to him and to her great benefit. He didn't seek her out, nor did he even know she was nearby. So he asks, "Who touched my clothes? Who touched my clothes?" So to put a bookend on the narrative, the woman, upon Jesus' inquiry into what had happened, very abashedly makes her presence known. The text reads that she came to him in fear and trembling. She is worried that Jesus will conform to the social conventions of his day and rebuke her for stepping out of line, for advocating for herself, for even appearing in public instead of recusing herself from society because of her alleged uncleanliness. For remember, her infirmity made her unclean. For these reasons, she approaches a man in authority who speaks with authority with fear and trembling, afraid for his rebuke, made at an unclean woman, unaccompanied by a male family member, one who has just touched a man in public, who has clout, a religious leader, in front of everyone and in front of Jairus, a man who has clout in his own right. Of course she was afraid that Jesus might fly off the handle and publicly rebuke her, and no one would have blamed Jesus if he had. But we all know that this isn't what happened. After all, it's Jesus, right? He says instead, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. He calls her daughter, a term of endearment. Then he sends her off with a blessing into her new life. Great story, but where am I going with this? Jesus possessed a healing power that had an immediate effect on the woman. He would discover who she was and in what way he had impacted her. But here's a question. How if he hadn't? How if he hadn't noticed or sought her out? One can just as easily imagine the woman fading back into the crowd. If she had, she'd have been lost to history. I wonder how many others were made whole by the healing presence and person of Jesus, who we never hear about. It seems as though he exuded life-giving energy, and this was why people flocked to him from all over the land, which leads me to wonder how many others were affected by the life-giving power Jesus possessed, who we'll never hear about. Now, I'd like to flip it around and apply this question to us. Remember, I began this talk with some musings about how we'll never know the impact we are having in real time on those around us. It's as if we are walking through life, brushing shoulders with countless others pressing in on us, unawares of the powers that flow through us, powers to harm and powers to heal. That woman who needed healing most certainly had up until that point brushed up against the hems of coats of persons who would have said to her the very opposite of what Jesus did when he named her daughter and sent her away with a blessing. I'll not even try and guess what slurs and derogatory words she had heard in her life, each in turn affecting her very spirit, her essence, her sense of self-worth. Interactions like these very likely are what taught her to approach persons like Jesus as she did, in fear. Now, if Jesus had been anyone else, she may well have left that interchange more scarred and sicker than she had been before she reached out in desperation. And what's more, those who had hurt her up until that moment in her life were probably wholly unaware of the impact they had on her because they were either ignorant of their impact on her life or worse, they just didn't care. I wonder how many persons we are affecting without even knowing it. No doubt some careless words I have spoken have stuck with not a few individuals in the world, and I'll never even know what damaging impact they had. Every day across the globe, there are billions of human interactions. Some actions pushing others towards despair, isolation, anger, hatred, fear, self-loathing. Other actions leading strangers even, and loved ones alike, to life, living waters, healing, wholeness, and a greater sense of self-worth. How many persons have I pushed towards death or have led to life? I will never know. You'll never know. And this is truly sobering to consider, which is why those who attempt to follow Jesus must be very careful. Followers of Jesus must commit to living in such a way that we reflexively and with hardly any deliberation lead those around us to life because it's simply who we are. It's in our DNA as children of God who are made in God's image. In other words, we should be Christ-like, living like Jesus because God has given us a new heart, one that beats like God's. We must be as Jesus walking through the crowd, unawares of the people brushing up against our lives, the whole while affecting those strangers in positive, life-giving, healing, wholesome ways. We must refrain from words or actions that drive a wedge between us and those others we interact with. Repay rudeness or overt hostility even with radical kindness. repay unfounded suspicion with the benefit of the doubt. Dare I say trust? Who knows what lasting impact these small or large positive actions may have? And again, you'll never know. But we must be as Jesus was when he repaid his own executioners with the words from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Who knows what healing and restorative power those words have brought into the human condition? Billions of lives changed by them and still counting. So who knows? You'll never know your impact, for the good or for the bad, which is a lot to contemplate because lives are at stake. Lives are ruined or made by these actions. Keep this in mind as you move through life. Try to notice the nameless strangers moving through the crowds whose life might be impacted by your very presence. Jesus healed those around him because of who he was, seemingly without any intention or at times even awareness. His followers must become like him and do the same. And the good news is, God is working even now to give us new hearts, hearts that beat like God's very own Son, Jesus Christ. And as I keep harping on about, you'll never know your impact on others in this life, but who knows? Maybe on the other side, we'll see it. And when we see it, we may hope to learn that we too were healers in our own time and in our own way. By God's grace, we too may join with Jesus in the movement to heal this world and all God's children in it. You too can be a healer.